Next game we're talking about is the big one, the Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all, and what could be the granddaddy of them all for games as well. Number 1 Oregon against number 8 Ohio State, New Year's Day at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on ESPN. This is obviously one of the best games in college football that we had in the regular season in Eugene when Oregon won by 1 point over Ohio State. Now we got a rematch of it in the Rose Bowl, and I've heard a lot of people say, Dawn, this is essentially the national championship game. A lot of people are saying the winner of this game will go on to win the national championship. I don't know if I'll agree with that. Maybe we'll get to that at the end of the year. But
long way to go.
It's a long way to go.
It's the part where it is a little weird to have it in the quarters. But You know what? They had to play each other eventually. It felt like from the beginning of the season, and when we were doing preseason projection, it was, hey, these teams are going to play 2, if not 3 times.
Yep.
It's going to happen, and I'm glad it just did end up happening. And, of course, we get Big Ten and Pac-12 in the Rose Bowl. Like always. Nothing changes. No matter – the only constant – is change, but you know what? The other constant is the Rose Bowl being Big Ten and Pac-12, and maybe it'll be that every year. Who knows the way these two programs are going?
This is a classic Rose Bowl matchup. It just happens to be 2 Big Ten teams now playing in this game, Dawn. But yeah, I think what people were getting at by saying is the quote-unquote national title game in the quarterfinal round is these are the 2 best teams in college football. And I can get behind that. You could argue that these are the 2 best teams in college football right now. So I think that's probably what they were saying there. But you ultimately have the Oregon run game against the Ohio State run defense. What should we be looking out for when the Ducks are running the football?
Okay, here's where I'm looking. I don't think Oregon does anything particularly, I call it fancy, in their run game. They got a variety of concepts. They're actually not in the top 30 of any single run concept, so they can kind of get to anything, especially they got the duo of tackles that can do a lot of things, Josh Connerly and a Johnny Cornelius, right? And I'm looking at Oregon's offense. I go, okay, they just kind of run their base concepts, and they run them pretty well, right? And I go back and watch the first game between these 2 teams, and I'm like, what is going on here, right? Is it a scheme thing? Is it, because Oregon ran the ball pretty well in that game. And I think 2 guys that jumped out to me that were pretty quiet in that game were the Ohio State edge defenders we've been talking about all season, Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, where I just didn't feel like I saw them very much. Honestly, it just felt like they didn't play their best game. And then I go back and I look at the grades and I go, oh, they didn't actually. Both of them an identical 87.7 run defense grade this season. Jack Sawyer in that game in run defense, 53.6. That's his lowest grade in run defense in the last 2 years. JT Tuimoloau, 62.5, lowest on the season. I just think I didn't see them a whole lot, and they need to be better. Now, part of it is it felt like they were afraid of Oregon breaking contain. I just don't understand what they were afraid of this. And I know Jordan James and even Noah Whittington are really good at breaking this up, but it looked like they were playing a little bit wider than usual and playing harder to contain than usual. So we're going, okay, Oregon, then what do? They just run underneath into the B gaps because we're playing so wide and so far upfield. It seemed like they were very afraid of Oregon getting to the sideline. The other thing, Oregon ran to that left side a lot towards Connerly, right, at left tackle. Part of the reason is even though they have identical run defense grade, Sawyer is the more active guy in run defense than Tuimoloau. His grade, it's up there because in part because he had a huge game against Purdue where he graded like a 96, but he's still good. I'm not saying he's not a good run defender, just a little less consistent, and sometimes he kind of takes some gambles up there, right, when it comes to crashing down on these runs, but I didn't see that a single time from either of them. And I think what Oregon did is they ran to JT's side more often than not. I think it was 17 out of 26 of their design run concepts went to the left, okay? So it does 2 things. One, you're attacking who you assume is the less consistent run defender of the 2. And 2, you make Sawyer the backside defender more often than not, sometimes even unblocked in the zone schemes where you go, okay, he's got to sit backside contain because we got Dylan Gabriel's a read option threat. We got backs who could cut back. They just found different ways to take the aggression out of the 2 of them, which I think is a funny way to do it when you talk about, this Ohio State run defense. We kind of talk about, look, pick your poison. They got great players at all 3 levels, right? All 3. Cody Simon at linebacker, obviously. Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom really good at safety. Ransom's been one of the best run defending safeties in college football, but they found a way to somewhat mitigate the effect of Sawyer and Tuimoloau. So I think if Ohio State's going to stop the run in this game, they need these 2 to play like stars because this was really the one game all season where they didn't in this first matchup. I'm curious to see, 1, how often Oregon runs at one or the other, and 2, what are some things they can do to change it up? Or even if they have to change it up, honestly, they ran 60% zone runs in that game when they usually sit in the low 40s. They actually got simple in that game, and it worked, right? So I think especially Connerly and Tuimoloau off that left side, because that's where he lines up the vast majority of time, and then Sawyer's over the right tackle. He'll be over Cornelius most of the time. So I don't know if they'll switch it based on formation. They usually don't. They just have they're just like, we have two really talented possible first-round guys, and we let it rip. I think those two guys need to play a lot better in this game for Ohio State to win.
And those who have to play a lot better, Sawyer and Tuimoloau, the Ohio State corners have to play a lot better. Don't. My match to watch in the Oregon pass game is, will the Buckeye corners fail them again? So Oregon scored 32 points on Ohio State back in Week 7 in October. That's the only time Ohio State surrendered more than 17 points all year. In that game, Oregon attacked the perimeter of Ohio State's defense, avoiding the elite safety duo of Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom. Of Dylan Gabriel's 36 completions in that game, only 5 of them came from inside the hashes. Denzel Burke was the main culprit in that game for Ohio State. He allowed all 7 of his targets to be caught for 162 yards and 2 touchdowns. Denzel Burke, probably the worst performance of his entire career in that game. Wide receiver Evan Stewart, probably the best performance of his career in that game. Texas A&M transfer, caught 7 of his 8 targets for 149 yards and a touchdown, a lot of them against Denzel Burke in that one. And you broke it down in our last Ohio State game that we did, Dawn, against Tennessee. The Buckeyes' corners have kind of been the Achilles heel of their defense all year. As you can see in their position breakdown and where they rank in the FBS in terms of grading, best in the country at edge defender, best in the country at safety, top 10 linebacker, still top 50 on the defensive line at D tackle, and then cornerback, they're 83rd right now in college football. That's a problem against Dylan Gabriel and against Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart and all the other really talented weapons they have in Oregon. Dylan Gabriel on the season, only 29% of his passing attempts have come from outside the numbers, but they've proven to be really effective outside the numbers all year. 16th best in EPA per play on passes thrown to the outside. Their 38th one is inside the hashes. In that game against Oregon, Ohio State ran cover 1 about 31% of the time. Very, very high rate of cover 1 with just one safety back there and man coverage across the board. They put their corners on islands in that game, and obviously it did not work out putting your corners in unfavorable situations. I think playing with a lot more too high looks with Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs probably is the way for Ohio State to try to not be as horrible in the perimeter as they were in that game against Oregon, because to slow down this aerial attack, I think you need as many bodies back there as possible. And with Ohio State playing as much cover 1 as they did, they put their corners on islands, and Dylan Gabriel and Evan Stewart and those receivers, they absolutely toasted them. Yeah,
and what can happen, too, when you run that much man coverage is the run fits, too, are a little bit different. Yeah. And I think, one thing I saw on in the last game was, remember Dylan Gabriel's touchdown run down the right side, that read option? It was actually kind of a miscommunication between, who had contain in the run game, because Sonny Styles had the tight end and he goes to the flat. And then, again, Tuimoloau, on a rare occasion, playing on the right side of the offense, crashes and everything just breaks down from there. So I think they just have to do a better job. And look, in 12 out of 13 games they've played this year, they've done this well on defense, where everything fits together, right? The front matches the coverage, and it's all married together, and we got all the gaps filled and everything. This was the one game where they didn't quite do that, and I think they took, in the run game, a more cautious approach, and in the pass game, they felt like, at the time, hey, we have Burke and Igbinosun and even Jordan Hancock in the slot's been really good too. They took this approach where on the outside we think we have the advantage. Maybe now that they've seen the speed of Oregon once already and they have it on tape, take a little different approach. And like you mentioned, when you have 2 safeties like that, like Downs and Ransom, you can mix up coverages. You can play. Jim Knowles can call whatever he wants week to week. We've seen him get blitz heavy some weeks. We've seen him get single high heavy, man heavy, every which way you want to go about it. We've seen him prevent the middle of the field catches like we saw against Penn State. They have enough talent to go any which way they want on defense. They just have to figure out the adjustment and coverage to, especially on the outside, like you mentioned, to adjust to Oregon. I think the speed, especially. I think Oregon has a different level of speed than any other team in this conference. And Ohio State adjusting to that's going to be a big key in the run and pass game.
Absolutely. So Dylan Gabriel, Dolan, had one of the best performances of his season against Ohio State defense, which was kind of surprising. Will Howard also was spectacular, I thought, against Oregon in that October matchup as well. So what should we be looking for when he and the Buckeyes are throwing the ball in this game?
Will Howard, aside from the Michigan game when they didn't protect him at all, has been spectacular down the stretch of the season. So I wanted to know, what exactly is it that Will Howard is excelling at this year more than he ever has before. And kind of a similar thing to what you just talked about with Dylan Gabriel in that game. Well, I'll tell you, Will Howard can throw outside the numbers.
Oh, yeah.
And in this
it's easy to do that with Jeremiah Smith back there.
Well, fun fact here, when you're talking about at or outside the numbers, okay, Ohio State is the only team with 2 receivers inside the top 20 in receiving grade outside the numbers. Smith and Ibuka. Smith is in like 6th or 8th, somewhere in there, and Ibuka's 19th. They're the only team with 2 in the top 20, all right? Will Howard, at or outside the numbers this year, 91.8 passing grade, 14 big-time throws, 78% completion, number 1 in the country.
Wow.
Completion percentage, okay? 91.8 passing grade, at outside the numbers. I believe that's the same as Shedeur Sanders. That's what we're talking about, is he's played at an elite level throwing to the outside. And with Kansas State, it used to be with him because he doesn't have an A+, a Josh Allen arm. He's got a B+ arm maybe, right? But they find ways to work outside the numbers. So I think there's multiple things that Chip Kelly's done to really create these throws. When you see the way that they line up, first of all, the route concepts. When they get on one hash, okay, Howard is not going to make the throw to the far side go ball very often. It's just not. It's just he's got limitations to his arm. He's got a B+ arm. You know, those are throws that the Josh Allens and Justin Herberts of the world make. He doesn't make those throws. So what's going to happen is 3 things. 1, throw outside to the boundary, okay, and inside to the field. So everything's kind of flowing to the boundary, where we create, sometimes it'll even just be that one-on-one matchup with Jeremiah Smith into the boundary, like the go balls that we're constantly seeing him make one-hand freakish catches on, right? But everything kind of flows to the boundary, an area of space that's kind of cuts down maybe 12 to 15 yards of the wide side of the field to where, okay, this is everything within Howard's radius, but we're still getting to the outside because we have Smith and Ibuka and all these. And even, honestly, Carnell Tate's been really good down the stretch too. 2, through their formations and some of the motions, everything's condensed down. They do a really good job of condensing formations down, but a lot of teams, whereas they want to attack straight downfield with safety to the safeties, right? Like Penn State.
Yeah.
Ohio State, they'll motion guys in and then cut them back outside, and we'll get flood concepts going on to the outside, right? And they really use, instead of just like, because people think sometimes throwing outside the numbers, and this is a case for a team like an Ole Miss or like in Mike Denbrock's offense with Notre Dame or LSU, where it's just go balls. Well, if you throw outside the number, that's all you can do is just chuck up go balls. Well, no, if you can create all that space and you create floods and zones and scissor concepts and things like that, you can get it out there, and they've excelled throwing those. And the third thing I've noticed is, boy, putting your best weapons in the slot. We know about Ibuka. Let me tell you something. Jeremiah Smith did not have a game all season where he ran more than, I think he's been under 25% of his routes in the slot for the whole season. Until we get to this Tennessee game, and now it's up over 40%. So now not only is Jeremiah Smith as freaky as he is on the outside, we start putting him in the slot.
With free releases.
And we saw that. We saw a cut split to the post. Remember the touchdown against Nebraska, the deep ball down the middle? I mean, that's something I'm looking at, is formations with cut splits and tightening everything down just so we can work back outside. We just want that snap, the space pre-snap, right? And then Smith and Ibuka, one on the same side, the two of them on the same side of the formation. That's just not fair. That should be illegal. And 2, the fact that if they're going to get Smith moving around more and playing in the slot instead of just being the X that we sometimes throw go balls to, good luck. That's good luck with that. I mean, I think the guy, and look, Oregon's secondary, especially the corners, we got good players back there. We got Jabbar Muhammad. We got Nico Reed. I think Brandon Johnson is really going to be a key player here in the slot. The first matchup, gave up 11 catches for 82 yards and a touchdown. And, on these outside throws, outside the numbers, even in this game against Oregon, Will Howard had 186 yards. Outside the numbers, and I'm talking outside college numbers.
Yeah.
It's only like 9 yards of space to work with on each side there, and they found their avenues to get the ball outside, on these outside throws. So I think Ohio State, that's going to continue. That's a problem, especially when you talk about when you're running these tighter formations and you have freaks, absolute freaks that you're putting in the slot. You can't just man up on them. You can't do it. They have a 3-way go. They could go in, out, or vertical, right? So I think Oregon, they're going to have to be really disciplined, more disciplined than they were in the first game, preventing these outside throws. Because I kept going back to, remember the sequence, Ohio State against Indiana? It was at like 3rd and 30. And Howard, they improvised a one throw. He improvised a one throw outside the numbers of Carnell Tate. And then the next play on 4th and 10, they go right back to the corner, like to the same exact spot.
Yep.
That's what I'm getting at. It's stressing you out horizontally. That's what Ohio State's going to do. If you don't prevent those outside throws, you're going to have a big problem.
Yeah, they need a run game as well, Dawn, in this one, because I think the Ohio State offensive line's got to generate more movement up front. This run game struggled so much back in that matchup with Oregon. TreVeyon Henderson did have 90 yards on 11 carries, but 70 of those yards came on 2 big runs in the first quarter. So other than that, I mean, he had, 9 carries for 20 yards on the other 9 runs he had in that game. And then really Quinshon Judkins, 23 rushing yards on 10 attempts. In any game that Quinshon Judkins has played, whether you go back to his time at Ole Miss or this one, if he's had a carry in a game, he's had more than 23 yards, right? So this is the lowest rushing total of his entire career in that game against Oregon. The biggest issue in that run game, as it's been with really any floundering run game this year, the 5 men up front, the offensive line, just could not get anything going. Dawn, they had a 48.4 run blocking grade against Oregon in that game. Second worst of the season. The only one where it was worse was Michigan. So the 2 games where Ohio State lost this year, they're their 2 worst run blocking grades of the season. And since that game against Oregon, Ohio State has a 48.4 run blocking grade as 98th in the country. Buckeyes also, in that game, Seth McLaughlin was there. The Remington Award-winning center was playing in that game. He's out for the season now with a torn Achilles. Josh Simmons played a little bit of that Oregon game that got hurt immediately. That's where he suffered his season-ending injury in that Oregon game as well. Ohio State largely stayed within the tackles against Oregon. 17 of their 29 carries came on either inside zone or man concepts. The Ducks have been strong between the tackles, 21st in defensive grade when runs are inside on them, thanks to guys like Derek Harmon on the inside, and they're really good linebackers as well. Outside zone, though, 109th in the country, an area that I think Ohio State could exploit if they want to find more success. But the problem is Ohio State only calls outside zone 14% of the time, which is 72nd in the country. So I think Ohio State's got to get a little more outside on Oregon in their run game in this game. They just got to try to go right downhill on them with some the backup at center, and obviously you got your left guard playing left tackle now, so you got another left guard to back up as well. I just think Ohio State's got to get a little more outside on them with TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins against Oregon, or else I don't know if they're going to have too much of a run game again.
I think there's a couple of things that give me hope here, though, if I'm an Ohio State fan talking about their run game. One, their offensive line in general, last week against Tennessee, another really tough defensive front, that was the best game they've played in a while.
Yeah.
Probably since before that Oregon game. Okay, so maybe, a couple weeks of preparation, getting the right guys in there, and making up for, because remember, Josh Simmons getting hurt during that Oregon game, you could feel the difference the second he went out. I mean, at the absolute second that he went out, it was a whole different ball game, right? And it had huge impact. Even like you mentioned, they still had McLaughlin, but losing Simmons in the middle of their biggest game of the year, not fun at all. So I think, look, this is bound to be the question with Ohio State if they're going to win a national title. Can this offensive line just do enough? The other thing, Chip Kelly's done, I think, a much better job of getting to the outside, putting in a little more window dressing in the run game, and getting kind of some influence going and getting to the ball to the perimeter, right? They're not going to be, at this point with this offensive line, an elite team running between the tackles. They're not going to. If they're good enough, if they can rip off 4.5, 5 yards of carry somewhere, decent, cool. But they're not going to be elite inside the tackles. I think the way that Chip Kelly's been getting the ball to the outside, and not just in the run game, similar to what I mentioned with Arizona State, in the screen game too, I think he's been doing a good job, especially with TreVeyon Henderson, getting him outside, putting him in space. Because they're a perimeter team now, right? That's what Ohio State is. We have to accept that. This is another tough front, though. You mentioned Uiagalelei, Harmon, Caldwell, Jordan Birch. You got some super talented players and huge guys up front, right? Isn't that the thing you're always talking about? Oregon's got like the biggest defensive line in the country.
All their defensive linemen, whether it be edges or D tackles, I think are 280 pounds or heavier.
That's just silly. I mean, so look,
which points to you could get outside of them though, right? If they're that big.
Absolutely. You're talking about and Uiagalelei is really athletic and Birch is really athletic and they're freaks at 280 plus, but if you can get outside, then you can start stressing east and west, and then maybe you get back between the tackles. But I'm not expecting an elite production between the tackles in any game they play right now. That's just not the way they're built. They're a perimeter team, and I think Chip Kelly's done a better job of mixing up the concepts lately And then, like I mentioned, throwing to the outside too stresses this thing. I think that's the whole bit. You saw that against Tennessee, throwing outside, and then there was the big touchdown run inside on counter because everybody's spread out east and west. I think the Ohio State offensive line is the X factor in this whole thing. It's going to be the X factor in every game they play the rest of the way.
Absolutely. So, Dawn, in what was one of the best games of the year that we had between Oregon and Ohio State, Oregon won by 1 point in Eugene. Will Oregon once again beat the Buckeyes in the Rose Bowl, move on to the semifinals, or will Ohio State end Oregon's perfect undefeated season?
Obviously, the hardest game of the week to pick, maybe the hardest game of the year to pick, being that we do already have a data point on this. But you know what I keep going back to with that first game? Ohio State should have won.
Yeah.
Will Howard drove them down into field goal range.
Yeah, the OPI,
and then
right?
we had the OPI, and then we screwed up taking too long on the last play. He should have won. Ohio State should have won, and that was at Oregon in a game where, even now with all the performances we've seen, that was the second worst game their offensive line played all year outside of the Michigan game. That was the worst game their defensive line played all year. Ohio State is very rarely at a disadvantage in the trenches. And it's very hard to beat a team this talented twice. I'm taking the Buckeyes.
Ooh,
I'm going
okay.
34-30. I know it's kind of there's a lot of, I think, even in the point spread and some different things, maybe some recency bias going on here, maybe a little bit, but it's very hard to beat a team like this twice. They still, through everything you just said about the O-line and Josh Simmons getting hurt and Quinshon struggling and everything that happened, Will Howard still drove them down to win the ball game, and they should have won. I'm going to take them to get their revenge. And it's going to be a great football game. This is as 50-50 as we could possibly get. It was 50-50 the first time. We had a 1-point game that went down to the wire, right? It's probably going to be the same way, I'm guessing, on the score, because it's going to be tight and you just pick some tight score. Ohio State 34-30. I think Will Howard stays hot. I think the big thing for me is what their offensive line showed me last week against Tennessee. They were the better unit on the field. And that's a Tennessee team with crazy levels of talent on their D-line. Chip Kelly called a fantastic game. Their O-line played a good enough game, which is all they – if their O-line plays like they did last week against Tennessee, they can absolutely win the whole thing. Yeah. Absolutely, they can win the whole thing.
I think they will win the whole thing.
If they play like that in all four of these games, Ohio State will win the national title. But that's the X factor. If they block well enough in this game, it's another tough task against that D-line. I think that's the key right there. If they protect Will Howard and they get enough going in the run game, I think they'll win this ball game because they should have the first time.
All right, you have Ohio State by 4. I got Oregon by 4
Here's
in
your
this
shot.
game. 31-27. Yeah, I'm 1 game down on you right now in our predictions this year. So if we get this one right, we are tied going into the semifinals. I'm hoping that happens, but I think the Ducks will do enough to stifle Ohio State's run game again. I don't know if Ohio State's offensive line performance against Tennessee is repeatable. I still have some questions about that offensive line right now. That happens, then once again, it's Dylan Gabriel against Will Howard. And we saw in that game in October, Gabriel and those receivers can make some plays against the Buckeyes' struggling corners in this one. So I think Oregon will win the Rose Bowl and then move on to play either Arizona State or Texas in the college football playoff semifinals. So I got Oregon winning. Dalton's got Ohio State winning in a rematch of one of the best games of the entire season. But hey, thanks for watching another episode of the PFF College Football Show. Please make sure you guys subscribe to the channel.
Also, subscribe to PFF Plus at subscribe.pff.com for all of the same data and grades that we use in our show, plus fantasy tools, betting tools, and our mock draft simulator.